Before we begin, let's all take a moment and close our eyes. Imagine you've just crossed the border into the United States from Mexico. You crossed with your young daughter in hopes of creating a better life for her. Her mother was murdered right in front of her, so the doctors had told you that you must never leave her side. But as you cross, you are captured by Border Patrol and your daughter is taken from you, and as she's screaming for you, your heart is in tatters. Because you don't know where she is, because they refuse to tell you where she is. Open your eyes. That story wasn't imagined. That was the story of Aaron Ramos, a man who was detained by ICE. ICE has been the cause of suffering for thousands of people. This branch of the government is one that is long overdue for reform. Due to the Trump administration's implementation of new rules for ICE, this organization has gone too far with its treatment of immigrants that it should now be abolished. Now, I have done an immense amount of research in order to speak on this topic so that I can inform all of you guys about it. I will essentially be discussing the problems with ICE, what the cause is, and how abolishing ICE is the best option for a solution. Before we get into the solution though, let me tell you about why ICE should be abolished. You see, the problem with ICE is the way they handle immigration. They don't treat immigrants as human beings. It is a very racist and corrupt organization. ICE was founded in 2003 after the attack on 9/11 in 2001. So it's no secret that the government founded ICE out of hate and prejudice. Most of what I will be discussing are things that have been broadcasted on the news and on social media. A lot of what the problem entails is not a secret, and hopefully it will open the eyes of those who didn't know what ICE has been doing. Out of the many atrocities that ICE has committed, I will be talking about 3 things they've done, starting off with the violation of the Constitution. The United States of America has long since been in full support of the Constitution. It is one of the founding documents of this country, granting us individual rights and protections. However, when ICE is involved, those constitutional rights are thrown out the window when it comes to immigrants. The administration had implemented new laws for Border Patrol in hopes to bring up the deportation rate. According to the ACLU in 2020, quote, "These enforcement programs pose a variety of threats to civil liberties. They implicate the 4th Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, the constitutional guarantee of due process, and the constitutional guarantee of equal protection and freedom from discrimination based on race, ethnicity, and national origin." ACLU 2020, end quote. In fact, in an article by the LA Times, the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Jay Johnson, acknowledged, quote, "The increasing number of federal court decisions that hold that detainer-based detention by state and local law enforcement agencies violates the 4th Amendment," end quote. This alone shows the hypocrisy that is the ICE organization. Time and time again, the American government has told us about the importance of our Constitution and the rights that we have because of it. But they set it aside when it comes to immigrants, showing that the government doesn't acknowledge them as human beings because they refuse to grant them human rights. In more upsetting news, ICE is also separating families at the border. This is an issue that has been discussed for many years already, but it has progressively gotten worse. According to the government's data from just this year, quote, "At least 2,654 immigrant children were separated from their parents or caregivers." ACLU 2020, end quote. Children detained by ICE have also been reported missing, meaning ICE has lost track of them. According to the Department of Health and Human Services, ICE had lost track of about 1,475 migrant children. Many of the children that are detained have also crossed without their parents, and when this occurs, many of the children are put in groups, homes, or with adult sponsors. The government has lost track of children this way as well. In an article published by the New York Times in 2018, it is said that, quote, "The Department of Health and Human Services has placed more than 135,000 unaccompanied immigrant children with adult sponsors in the United States as they wait for their cases to be heard by an immigration judge." 2018, end quote. Separating the children from their parents has led many of these children to be essentially parentless. According to the Trump administration, they have yet to track down the parents of 545 children, and that 2/3 of those parents were deported to Central America without their children. NBC 2020, end quote. The sad part is that many of these children aren't even aware that their parents have been deported. Also, the way that ICE treats the detainees is also incredibly inhumane. There have been multiple accounts and witnesses claiming that conditions inside of the detention centers are terrible. According to an article written by Time magazine in 2020, quote, adults and children have been held for days, weeks, and even months in cramped cells, sometimes with no access to soap, toothpaste, or places to wash their hands or shower. Some reports have emerged of children sleeping on concrete floors, others of adults having to stand for days due to lack of space, end quote. And the health of all the detained has only worsened because of COVID-19 virus spreading like wildfire there. The Intercept published an article with different letters from the detainees in 2020. Some of them read, quote, I'm going to ask to be deported because being locked in this place, there's no peace, not psychologically or emotionally, end quote. Another letter goes, quote, please help us obtain our freedom. It's so dangerous these days. We find ourselves between life and death. We don't want to be the victims of this ruthless virus, and here in these conditions, really, it's just a matter of time, end quote. These problems are not ones we should take lightly, and as you've just heard, they are ones that should be dealt with immediately. The problem with ICE all had to begin somewhere, though. The separation of families, the breaking of the Constitution, the horrible treatment of the detainees, someone had to give the okay for all of this to occur and continue. The reason that ICE is the way it is goes back to the roots of our racist government. Racism is etched in this country's ground. The United States is stolen land built through the blood, sweat, and tears of enslaved people, many of which were also stolen from their lands. Now they use ICE as a way to keep people out, even though it was many of their ancestors who used to own this land until they were forced out. The administration that which ICE is under currently has gone overboard with their take on immigration. As of now, prejudice and hate has been ingrained in the U.S.'s immigration and customs enforcement. ICE has always been enforcement for immigration, but under the Trump administration, ICE seems to have become another branch of the military set on policing instead of protecting. Instead of focusing on keeping out dangerous people as ICE was originally meant to do, it turned into a game of how many people can we kick out? According to an article written by the government executive in 2019, through a public records request of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, we obtained data on 1,199,026 ICE encounters, 381,370 arrests, and 650,944 removals that occurred between January 2016 and September 2018, end quote. Although Obama had also deported a lot of people, Trump has had a different objective in mind. He believes that in order to make America great again, the government needs to deport people that aren't citizens, which is downright racist. One of the ways that Trump decided to up the deportation rate was through his zero tolerance policy. An article written by the Human Rights Watch, written in 2018, explains the policy well. They wrote, quote, the April 2018 policy directs U.S.'s Attorney's Office along the southwest border to accept for criminal prosecution all cases involving illegal entry, that is, entering the U.S. without authorization, referred to them by U.S. Customs and Border Protection, to the extent practicable, end quote. Donald Trump had actually enacted this policy just a week after he was elected president. Before Trump was in office, ICE would only arrest immigrants that were seen as dangerous. But because of the policy that Trump created, it doesn't matter what kind of person you are. If you're not a citizen, then you can be detained by ICE. People come into the U.S. to seek asylum, but it is now incredibly difficult to come in legally at all to stay here. Permanent residency cards are still available. In fact, my mother has one. However, during the COVID-19 outbreak, Trump temporarily banned access to getting a green card, making it incredibly difficult for immigrants to seek asylum in the U.S. Trump had also made it harder for people to become citizens by raising the price for naturalization. According to an article published by U.S. News in 2020, quote, the agency upped the cost to apply online to become a citizen from $640 to $1,160, an 81% increase, end quote. It is also important to remember that there is a waiting list to become a citizen, and it is very long. and it is still possible to be deported during that time, regardless if you're in the process of getting it. Because of the lack of compassion from our government, immigrants are suffering inside and outside of the detention centers. Since our current government won't do anything to protect immigrants, it is our job to find a solution instead. As of right now, there is no way to guarantee the well-being of immigrants while ICE is still around. The only way that all of the unnecessary suffering can end is if ICE is completely abolished. Too many people have been and continue to be hurt by ICE, including people that I know. And perhaps some of you guys also know people that have been affected by them as well. Because the best solution is to abolish ICE, I will go over how that can be done. A step towards the right direction of abolishing ICE is to cut the funding they receive and instead fund organizations that focus on helping immigrants instead of punishing them. According to Newsweek in 2019, the Trump administration had been, quote, seeking $8.3 billion in discretionary funding for ICE as well as $525,000, $60 million in budget authority to cover mandatory fees. This adds up to a total of around $8.8 billion. The administration's proposed 2019 ICE budget represents an increase of $967 million when compared with 2018's ICE budget. 2018's budget was $7.6 million. End quote. This amount of funding is extremely excessive, considering the lack of resources and the unfavorable conditions that the immigrants are in. Most of the funding goes towards resources for the ICE agents instead of the immigrants that they are meant to be taking care of. Cutting the funding that ICE receives would be an enormous step in getting rid of this branch of the government altogether. Another excellent way to begin the abolition of ICE is to spread awareness about the atrocities that ICE commits on the daily. Many activists have taken to social media and news to let people know about the truth of what is happening inside of the detention centers. The spread of the news has sparked protests and petitions calling for change and abolishment of ICE. PBS News even mentioned in an article they wrote in 2018 that, quote, while some senators have called for re-examining ICE, calls to dismantle the agency have so far been led by a small but vocal group of progressive activists and lawmakers, end quote. In other words, the more people that know why ICE needs to be abolished, the higher the chance it is for it to actually happen. As much as awareness helps, there's one thing that must be done in order for ICE to be abolished, and it is to elect people that support the abolishment of ICE. It is incredibly important to have people that stand by the act of abolishing ICE in positions of power. If the government is filled with people who support ICE, as it is now, there will be no changes made. A perfect example of a person in power who wants to abolish ICE is Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She has been using her platform to spread awareness, and she's in a position to make an impact in this cause. Luckily, the current president of the United States, Donald Trump, will be leaving office this coming January because Joe Biden is now president-elect. And although he doesn't want to abolish ICE, he does want to make a change, which is a step forward in the right direction. These are some of the ways that we can do our part in trying to abolish ICE. Keeping everything that I've said in mind, it's no wonder that ICE needs to be abolished. ICE has become a threat to the livelihood of immigrants, from the zero-tolerance policy to the horrible conditions inside of the detention centers. The government has done everything in its power to keep people out, and we should do everything we can to keep that racist government out. People have suffered enough. ICE needs to be stopped. It must be abolished. All it takes is for us to put ourselves in another's shoes. We could only imagine the heartache that immigrants go through daily because of ICE, and it's because we have the privilege just to imagine and not live it that we should do something about it. Abolish ICE.